what you do before and after your podcast is almost more important than the podcast itself.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Tech Your Business podcast. So today, we are talking to a podcast expert. Like I said, the guests we're going to have on this show are going to be experts in the field of whatever they're talking about, and they're going to know a lot more than I do. So I'm just going to be a student and I listen to them. So we're talking to Kevin Palmieri today, and Kevin is a successful podcast coach and podcast host also. He's the host of the Next Level University podcast. I listened to a couple of episodes of that. I think there are about 1,300 and something episodes so far. That's an episode a day. I was overwhelmed when I saw that. Hopefully I'll get there someday. So Kevin has been in a lot of he's a really expert business person. He's done a lot of things before he settled on podcasting. So he'll talk to us about all of that. And today he'll talk about using podcasts to grow your business. I talked to Kevin after I started this podcast, and we had a pre-call about 15 minutes or so. And in that 15 minutes, I heard a lot of things that I never thought about starting the podcast. So I feel if you want to use a podcast in growing your business, this episode would just be the perfect one for you. So now, down to the episode. So Kevin, let's talk about podcasting on the podcasts.
Let's do it, Peter.
Why podcasting?
Why podcasting? Now more than ever, I think two thoughts I have. One, it's very, very easy to start a podcast. It's the barrier to entry is very, very low. You don't need that much equipment. You don't need a great camera. You don't even need to record the video if you don't want. You can order a microphone online for $70, do a couple things, and you're kind of off to the races. So it's very, very easy. The barrier to entry is very, very low. And it's an exponentially growing niche. Like podcasts are growing so quickly. They really grew through COVID. People are listening to podcasts. And this is my thought. So let's just say Nike, for example. Nike is one of the biggest companies in the world for sports performance gear. If they had a podcast, and I'm sure they probably do, but let's just say hypothetically, if they had a podcast where they interviewed Nike-sponsored athletes and they promoted their own stuff. So today we're talking with Kevin Durant, we're talking with whoever it is, insert a world-famous athlete here. They do a mid-tro, and in the middle they say, hey, we have these new shoes coming out. For everybody listening, we're going to give you a 10% discount. Just click the link in the show notes. Boom. They're going to do some really good business there because they're going to attract people that wouldn't normally buy their shoes potentially. So the other interesting thing about a podcast is it allows you to attract an audience that you might not attract if you only had a paid offering, right? If you're adding free value, you're going to attract people who just want to listen to you talk about what you talk about. And then eventually you can monetize through something that's in alignment with your business. So if you think about it this way, a comedian will have a podcast, and this is just how it works for them. They have a podcast where they are funny. They tell jokes. They have people on, other comedians. They take their social media and they put podcast clips on it, and then they sell out clubs or arenas, and boom, that's their business. So as long as the content you're talking about on the podcast can be aligned and connected to something behind some sort of paywall, the podcast is a really, really good opportunity for a business.
That's really nice. So basically, a podcast is something like freemium. I think they call it freemium information you can give, so people get a taste of what you have to offer and they can pay for your paid offerings. That's really nice. So you talked about Nike and a comedian. So for businesses, like we're on the Tech Your Business podcast, for businesses, what kind of businesses would benefit from having a podcast?
I am yet to find one that wouldn't benefit, really. And it's just, you have to be creative with the content that you talk about. So I've worked with everybody from stay-at-home moms to airline pilots who are into passive income investing to self-improvement podcasts, to personal trainers, to nutrition people. It's really, the thought process is, as long as you're talking about something on the podcast that is connected to your offering, you can find a way to make money doing it. Really. I mean, that really is the simplest way to explain. Now, obviously, it's not a quick thing. It takes a long time. You got to play social media into it. You have to understand the sales that goes behind it. But as long as you can align the content with the offer, I don't know if there is a business that can't make money with a podcast. Or let's do this. Maybe making money isn't the goal. Maybe you use it as marketing. So what's your marketing budget? Well, say it's $1,000 a month. Okay, cool. You can hire a team and you can have people hammer out social media content, and you could spend $1,000 a month running your podcast and then promoting it all over social media. That's another way to market, because you're marketing through adding value and through creating a warmer community of people who are more likely to make a purchasing decision later. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a niche or a category I wouldn't suggest to start a podcast, honestly.
That's really great. So at the beginning, you talked about the low barriers to entry to starting a podcast. But I remember when I started the podcast, it was complicated because there were so many options. It talked about this and that and that, and I had a lot of things to figure out before I finally got it live. So for a new business owner thinking of starting a podcast, what's the process they would go through?
Yeah, number one is let's get wildly specific on what we're going to talk about. And I always ask this: what problem are we solving for what person in what specific way? All right. So what is the through line of this podcast? What are we going to build the reputation of this podcast on? So that's step one. Step two is coming up with a good name. A good name can get you pretty far. A bad name can hold you back for a long, long, long period of time, unfortunately. From there, you got to find, I would say, order a microphone, right? There's one, it's the ATR 2100 by Audio-Technica. I always recommend it. I'm not sponsored. I don't get any money for it. It's something we used. I literally have it over here. It's something we used for the first 700 episodes. So it worked really, really well. So I always talk about that. It can plug directly into your laptop via USB. You don't need any extra cables. You don't need a mixer. You don't need any of that. Cool. You're off to the races. From there, you got to find a host. So one of the common misconceptions when it comes to podcasting is you got to find a way to get your podcast on Apple and Spotify and Google Play and all these other places, iHeartRadio, when in reality, you're going to sign up to a podcast host. All your podcast host does is it's where you store your podcasts, and it's connected to all those. So I always use the analogy of a group text. If Peter, myself, and 50 of our friends are in a group text, every time Peter sends a message, we all get it. It's very similar with the podcast host, where you upload your episode to the host, and every place that's connected to the host gets the episode. So you only have to upload it to one place, and then boom, it pushes it out. After that, you got to record an intro, you got to record an outro, and I always suggest you record a trailer. Now, there are many ways to do this. You can jump on Zoom and just record the audio. You can download Audacity. I know Peter's using Audacity right now. It's a free software. I love Audacity. We've used it for a long time. There are paid ones, but here's a little hack. If you have a voice recorder on your laptop, you can actually record directly to your laptop, and you're going to get really high quality audio because it doesn't have to go up to the internet, and it doesn't really depend on an internet connection. So we're looking for an intro, 30 seconds of who are you? What is this podcast about? What can your listeners expect to learn? And why should they listen to you? Simple. Outro is thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you liked it, please leave a review, subscribe, and tell a friend. Follow us on social media, right? Any number of calls to action. And then your trailer episode, you want to be 1 to 3 minutes of a deeper dive into the intro. So just a little backstory of you, why you started this podcast, what are people going to get from it? What can they expect? What are they going to learn? Why should they stick around and tune into the next episode? In reality, all you need to launch is you need the trailer. And once you have your trailer, you can send that up to your host, and then you'll apply to be on Apple and all that. Bada bing, bada boom. From there, you got a podcast, right? And then you're off to the races. That's the simplest thing. And now YouTube is a really, really good place to find this stuff out, because a lot of people have started podcasts. So there's a lot of hints and tips and tricks and breadcrumbs if you are struggling.
So far, it has been a learning experience for me, because a lot of these things you talked about are things I'm going to apply to the podcast. You talked about the intro, you talked about the outro, you talked about the trailer, you've talked about the picking a specific topic to talk about. How important is that? A specific topic?
Yeah, I mean, we have to give the audience an opportunity to self-identify. And all that means is I would rather somebody know very quickly that the show is not for them, because by the same definition, somebody is also going to know very quickly if the show is for them. So if you want to grow it and you want to get the right audience, it should be pretty specific, because you're building a brand. Again, we'll use Nike. I guess Nike will be the through line for this. Nike doesn't have restaurants. Nike doesn't have cell phone plans. Nike has sports. That's what Nike does. They do sports and all things involved with sports. That's kind of their niche. That's where they're going to stay focused. So yeah, it's very important to pick something and stay in that, because what you're going to do is you're going to create an audience based on that. And once you create an audience based on expectations, that's what they're going to expect every week, every episode. So you got to keep in alignment with that. That way you hang on to the audience you have, but you also build a deeper audience based on your area of expertise or, area of focus.
That's really, really good. So at the end of the day, by focusing on one topic, focusing on one niche, or focusing on that thing, you're building a group of people that stay loyal to you, because they're always expecting to hear about that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
I understand that, because at the beginning you talked about podcasts becoming popular during COVID, and that was when I started listening to podcasts, actually, not too long ago, and I listened to a lot about. I listened to business podcasts. I listened to motivational podcasts. I listened to podcasts too. Your podcasts. I've listened to about 4, 5, 6, or 7 of them when I'm taking my morning walk, and the content is really, really good for something that comes out every day. So for a podcast like yours, it's every day. But for a typical business, how often do you think a typical business should publish?
Yeah. So this is always my thought. You start with something that's sustainable, and then you figure out what can you actually do consistently. The easiest answer, I always say once a week, is probably the best place to start. And honestly, for a lot of businesses, that's all they're going to end up doing anyway. Once a week is usually a really good place to start, and it's a good groove to get into. It's consistent. So we do an episode every day for different reasons, right? 1, the mastery of getting better as a podcaster. 2, we believe in 1% improvements every day. So if I'm going to talk to the audience about getting better, the least I can do is be there every day. We're playing a different game when it comes to our podcast. That's why we do things in a certain way. But for most businesses, because here's the other thing. A lot of businesses are behind when it comes to social media. They're not leveraging social media and digital marketing to the level that they could. So this is what you do. You sit down once a week, you record a 45-minute podcast episode, you cut that into 10 pieces of micro content, and then you share it all over social media. And then from a business perspective, you're getting 10 outputs from one 45-minute input of your time. That's a really good return on your investment of time. So yeah, it really depends on what the long-term goal is, but I would say 1 episode per week is a really, really good place to start. But I would add this, Peter. I said this recently. What you do before and after your podcast is almost more important than the podcast itself. So when I think about setting up a podcast as a business, the top of the business is social media. if you have a podcast and you don't post on social media, it's not going to grow at the rate it would if you posted on social media. So you could be the most skilled podcaster in the world. It could be the best, the funniest. If it's not on social media, you're missing out on a giant opportunity. Now, after the podcast, what do? This is the beauty of the podcast. You have to figure out what is your call to action. So I have a frame for that. There is the highest probability and the highest return on investment. Those are the two calls to action I always suggest. So when you get to the end of the podcast, when we get to the end of the podcast, I'll say reach out or listen to our podcast. That's my call to action. That's highest probability. I'm never going to say, come work with me, because that's most likely not going to happen cold from a podcast. So you got to figure out what is your highest probability call to action. Here's an interesting thing. As a business owner, if you have some sort of like free offer, if you have some sort of group where people can get to know you at a deeper level, if you have something that is of massive value, but a low barrier to entry, that can be your call to action. Your call to action could be, hey, if you've ever thought of buying a Mercedes, we have a very big deal coming down the pipeline. You can find out more at this website or something like that. It's hard with a car because you're trying to sell it. So that muddies the water a little bit. But in an ideal world, you would have some sort of either community builder or low barrier to entry, high value ad. And that's what you would promote on the podcast. And then in theory, your conversion from podcast listener to next layer of the business would be pretty high. And then you kind of go from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I noticed that listening to your podcast, I noticed you put a link to your book club, which I plan to join because I buy a lot of books I don't read. Then also your Next Level Nation Facebook group. I saw that too. I think I joined it. I can't remember that. So yeah, so those are the highest probability calls to action you talked about. Okay, so now let's talk about format of the podcast. So there are there's the audio podcast, there's the video podcast, there's the solo podcast, there's the interview. For a business, what's the best?
Two thoughts. My thought is always, I want the podcast host to be the expert. That's always my thought, because I want your audience to reach out to you, not me. Right. So I like a solo podcast where you sit down and you say, okay, what are the top 25 to 50 problems my ideal client deals with? Right. I did a call with a web designer the other day. Okay. What are the top 25 to 50 problems your ideal client has? They're not getting conversion on their website. They don't even know what their website's supposed to do. They don't have measurements. They don't have data, whatever it is. It's not safe. It's not great, whatever. Okay, cool. That's a bunch of episodes right there. Like 3 things you should know about your website today. What's the number one reason you should have a website, right? So when I look at it from that perspective, that person becomes the industry expert who is solving the audience's problems. It only makes sense to reach out to that person. It only makes sense because they're already adding free value to you. So I like a solo approach when it comes to converting listeners to potential clients. If you're focused solely on podcast growth, I like a mixture of a solo episode and a guest episode, because obviously when you have a guest on, if they share the content, if they're a big name, you'll get an influx of people who didn't normally listen, but it doesn't necessarily lead to an influx of new clients because they're not there for you. So it really depends on what the goal is. I usually say solo episodes lead to money, guest episodes lead to listens. If we're talking in the realm of turning a listener into a client. Now, obviously there's sponsorships and there's ads and there's affiliates. I think that's really quite a hard game to get into because you need a lot of listens, where if you have 1,000 listens, you can potentially get clients out of that, but you're not going to get a lot of money paid to you for ads and sponsorships. But that is always an approach as well.
That's really interesting. One good take. So solo, money, guests, listens. That's what I've taken from there. So you talked about consistency at the beginning of this episode, and I noticed that when I started listening to podcasts, because I see a lot of podcasts, they do maybe 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, and they stop. But I noticed with your podcast, for the past how many years you've been consistent with your outputs, and that's one thing I plan to do with this podcast. Because when we started, I said we're going to do an episode a month. This month we opted to 2 episodes. Just put a process around it, and probably want to go up to an episode a week and see how it goes from there. Because one thing I've learned too in life is once you're consistent, the momentum you build from being consistent, it adds up over time. So for a business starting a podcast, where should they keep their expectations? When do they expect to get results?
Yeah, it's a great question. It really depends on how committed you are. I had a call the other day with someone, and they're a business owner, and they said, "Hey, I'm traveling. I'm going to be going." They live in the U.S. They said they're going to Scotland, I think, or Ireland, and they said, I'm gonna skip a couple episodes, and I'm just gonna do like some replays. Like we'll just replay old content. And I said, because he came to me and said, "What do you think of that?" And I said, "What do you think I think?" You know what I think. I think that's a terrible idea. You're going to lose all your momentum. It's not good. It's not smart. But I also understand that you spending time with your family is important. So I don't want you to have to lug around your gear and be stressing over recording podcast episodes. I said, I'm traveling. I'm going to Belgium in September. I'll have my podcast stuff with me because I'm going to record while I'm out there. But that's me. It's a bigger part of my business than it is his business. So the expectations, it's really hard to measure. I would say 1, it depends on your industry. 2, it depends on your connections. 3, it depends on what your current social media presence is. I mean, if you're somebody who has 100,000 followers, it's not hard to grow a podcast. It's pretty easy, honestly. If you're somebody who's starting from the ground up, if you get 1 to 5,000 downloads in the first year, believe it or not, you're kind of ahead of the curve. So then from there, it's like, how are you going to convert people from listeners to clients or customers or whatever it is for you? So I would say you can definitely make money in the first year. You can get 5,000 downloads in the first year. You'll make money because you're not going to spend that much money on the podcast, right? The equipment and the help you'll need is probably not going to be super expensive. You can definitely make that back, but it's really going to depend on your business acumen and your sales acumen, because a lot of what you're doing is you're opening up the opportunity to have one-on-one conversations. The amount of one-on-one conversations a podcaster is having is usually a really good indicator of how much money they're going to make, because it's not really what people think, where, like for you, Peter, you'll put this podcast episode out. Most likely nobody's going to reach out directly and say, "Hey, Peter, here's my money. You have it." It just doesn't really work that way. But somebody might reach out and say, "Hey, Peter, I heard this episode on blank. I absolutely loved it. Interesting." Potential client / customer just self-identified as, "I listen to your podcast." Now that's up to you to follow up on that conversation, add value, and then see if there's a fit with a paid opportunity or whatever it may be. So long answer long, it's very hard to create expectations because there's so many variables that add up to create that level of success. But I would say as long as you can be consistent, you can definitely make money in the first year if you do it correctly, and you can get, let's say 5,000 downloads is a realistic number. You could definitely get that in the first year.
That's good. That's really, really good. So you said the optimal schedule is an episode a week. And you said what you do before and after the podcast is more important than the podcast itself. So now, the average business owner, the average small business owner is not really, they know how to use social media, but they might not know how to, like you talked about, talking for 45 minutes and turning it into multiple clips of content and all that. So the average business owner would likely not be able to do that. So what sort of team would they be looking at to make this happen?
I mean, for me, I always tell people to go on Fiverr or go on Upwork and find a podcast producer. I mean, you could find someone for a very reasonable price. That's probably the best place to start. I mean, you don't need anything crazy. You need somebody who knows how to audio edit and video edit. And you can find somebody for a very good rate. That, or here's the other interesting thing. When you have a business, you have leverage. So say you're a business that is, I don't know, a supplement company. You could always say, hey, Peter, I know you love our supplements. We're going to send you 5 boxes per month. Can you do our audio and video editing? Boom. There you go. That's like a huge win-win. I do that. I've told so many podcasters to do that because you have a product or a service that somebody is obviously interested in. All right. You can always use that to add value to somebody else's life. So if you're on a budget, I would try that. If you have a little bit of a marketing budget, you can spend, I don't know, it might cost you for one episode a week. It might cost you $200 a month to get everything done. You could find somebody to do it for cheaper, but just be very, very careful about anybody who says that they're a podcast marketer, because most podcast marketers are just going to pay somebody to promote your podcast and it's going to tank don't do that. Do not do that. But find somebody who knows how to audio edit and video edit. And you'll be in a really good position if you do that. $200 a month to $500 a month is a good fee, I would say.
That's actually really, really affordable. Really, really affordable. So next, let's talk about you.
Sure.
Because I looked at your profile and everything. A lot of people listening on this show are all business owners, and we've all gone through a journey. We've all tried different things before we settled on what we are doing now. I have been through that, and I saw your story. You've been through that. So can you just tell us your story before podcasting, how you got to this point?
Yeah. So for me, I grew up in a household of single parents. So I was raised by my mom and my grandmother. I didn't know my dad. I didn't meet my dad until I was 27. That's when I met my father with the understanding that he was my father. So I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life early on. I didn't go to college because I didn't want to go and I didn't want to spend money. So I job hopped from a gas station attendant, personal trainer, truck driver. I cleaned hospital toilets and floors. I went to the fire academy. I did a lot of things. I just tried to figure out, how can I support myself? How can I support myself? I eventually got this job in an industry called weatherization. All that means is my company would go into large buildings, usually schools, and it was our job to make the building more energy efficient. So we'd work in the attics, we'd work above the ceilings, windows, doors, anywhere where good air can get out and bad air can get in. That's kind of what we did in a nutshell. So I was doing this job and I was making good money because I was working on a lot of state and government contracts. I grinded my face off and I worked 10 months. I worked on the road. So a lot of our contracts were out of state. So I spent 10 months living in hotels and driving 6 hours to the job site and ended up making $100,000 that year. And I remember when I opened my final pay stub of the year, I expected to feel very proud and confident and secure. And I expected a lot of my internal pains to go away, and that didn't happen. I expected external results to create internal fulfillment, and it just didn't work. So I ended up starting a podcast right after that because I realized for most of my life, I had lived unconsciously. The opposite of unconscious is hyperconscious. So I started a podcast called the Hyperconscious Podcast. I fell in love with podcasting, right? Probably like you. You seem like you're very, very into it and you enjoy it very much.
I'm really enjoying it.
Right? But I fell out of love with my job. So I started calling out of work. I started leaving the job early. I started showing up late. And eventually it got to the point where I woke up in a hotel room 6 hours away from home. And I had thoughts that if I ended my life, I would end all my problems. I was just super overwhelmed and I felt stuck and I felt trapped. So I ended up leaving that job 3 or 4 months later. And I went full-time into podcasting and full-time into being a business owner and being very broke and trying to figure out all of this business stuff. I mean, one of the reasons, I mean, if it sounds like I know what I'm talking about, one of the reasons is I just had to learn as much as humanly possible because I needed to figure out how to swim. It was very much sink or swim. And in the beginning, we were sinking.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that because there's someone that said entrepreneurship is throwing you in the sky and giving you the path to build a plane as you fall down. Yes.
Yep.
So okay, so you've done a lot more episodes than me, 1,300 and something. I think it was 1,350 something when I listened last, so it should be much more than that. So what lessons have you learned from all this?
Yeah, I mean, so many. I've probably learned more lessons about myself than anything else, but one of the big lessons is from day to day, progress is invisible. So I'll record, a few episodes today. I have 3 or 4 episodes tomorrow I'll record. I'm no better today than I was yesterday, at least not measurably. I can't see any difference, but from year to year, progress is impossible to miss. So if I go and look 365 episodes ago, I'm a lot better than I was then. It's hard to see that contrast because in the moment, you don't really feel like you're getting any better. I always use the gym analogy. You can go to the gym today, you can go to the gym tomorrow. Nothing's really going to change. You can diet today and you can diet tomorrow. Nothing's really going to change. It's really given me a very clear look when it comes to time perspective. From day to day, progress is invisible. From year to year, it's impossible to miss. That's really the big lesson for me. And the other thing is when you practice something often and you practice it intentionally, you can get really good at stuff. I don't think I'm a natural podcaster or a natural speaker or any of that, but I've tried really, really hard to just get a little bit better every day, to tell a story in a different way, to make the point land more powerfully, whatever it may be. That's been a really, really big thing for me.
That's because I was listening to one of your episodes where you talked about timelines, setting timelines, and how very little is impossible in a decade, and it really struck me because there are a lot of things where we say, oh, this should happen in a year, this should happen in a couple of months, and all that, and it doesn't happen. But in the long term, it always does. So podcasting is becoming a really popular medium. And like you said, the barriers to entry are low. So that means a lot of people are able to get into podcasting. So what do you see about the future of podcasting?
Yeah, so here's the interesting thing. I'll start with the potentially negative side. The barrier to entry is low and it will continue to get lower, which means the failure rate and the quit rate will continue to get higher. You mentioned this earlier, how I believe the stat is most podcasts only last between 3 and 21 episodes before they call it quits. That will probably continue and probably get even lower because the barrier to entry is very easy. You don't even need a microphone. You can literally record into your cell phone. But with the ease of entry, the ease of exit is also there. So I would say you can expect to see far more shows that come and go, unfortunately. What I really expect to happen is I expect that the podcast platforms will start treating themselves more like YouTube, where you'll actually be able to see comments and you'll be able to see subscriber numbers. It's very weird how I could lie to you right now and tell you we have 50 million downloads. And there's really no way for you to go find out. I mean, you could look at the reviews and say, I don't know, something's not adding up. But I know people who have done that. I've worked with people who tell me they have a certain amount of downloads. And then when I get behind the scenes and I look at their actual stats, that's not how many downloads they have. Right. And whatever, like, that's not my game. I don't want to play that game because that's not helping anybody. That's really hurting you in the long run. But I think the transparency has to come up. I think that's going to be the next level for the podcast industry. When you look at a YouTube video, you can see how many videos, how many views it has, how many comments it has, likes, dislikes. I think they got rid of dislikes, but there's data. There's public data. I think that's going to be the next step for the podcast industry because there's a lot of money in the industry, but there's not a lot of transparency of actual stats. So I expect that to get big. And I also think you're going to see an influx of famous people starting podcasts because it's easy for them. It's really, really easy money. An NFL player, like a famous NFL player, to start a podcast, they would get sponsorships immediately. So it's going to become that type of thing where if you have a big audience, you can really, really, really leverage podcasting in a positive way if you do it right.
Yeah, that's really good. So for business owners wanting to start their podcasts, I know a lot of people, for instance, for this Tech Your Business podcast, I remember I had the idea early 2021 and somehow we didn't start till late 2022. So for business owners wanting to start, what do you have to say to them? What advice do you have to give them? What tips do you have to give them? Anything I missed? What would you like to say to them?
Yeah, you're most likely overcomplicating it. I mean, that's always my thing is it's messy action. It's messy action. You cannot improve something that does not exist yet. So grab your cell phone and start recording. That's it. You don't have to have the best mic. You don't have to have the best headphones, the best background. That in the beginning, perfect is progress. That is the advice I would give to anyone. Or this is the other thing. If you have a budget, hire someone to help you. And they can basically do all the stuff for you and guide you. It all depends. If you're doing it yourself and you're bootstrapping, good is a good place to start. There's no such thing as perfect, and you can always get better. If you have capital and you're investing in it, hire somebody who knows what they're doing, and they'll make your life a lot easier if they actually know what they're doing.
Yeah, that's amazing. So today we've talked about why businesses should choose podcasting. We've also talked about what businesses are the best for podcasting, which is all businesses at the end of the day. We talked about the process to start your podcast from the choosing what to talk about to choosing a good name and finally recording. We've talked about what to do before and after your podcast. We've talked about how often you should publish your podcast. We talk about the formats for your podcasts and also the future of podcasting. So it has been an amazing episode today. Really amazing. So for listeners who want to learn more about you, to listen to your podcast, to contact you, or they enjoyed this episode and they want to learn more about the Next Level Universe and about Kevin, how do they reach you?
Yeah, like I said, I always suggest just listen to the podcast. It's called Next Level University. We're on all the platforms. We're on YouTube. And then I also have another podcast called Podcast Growth University that's all about podcasting. So if you are interested in starting a show, there's a bunch of free content there as well. And I talk about a lot of the stuff we talked about today, but maybe more deeply because I dedicate the entire episode to identifying your audience or whatever it may be. So that's also on YouTube and all the podcast platforms.
All right. So Next Level University and Podcast Growth University. So we'll have them in the show notes. So you can visit and learn more about Kevin Palmieri. All right. So thank you everyone for tuning in to the Tech Your Business podcast. And see you on another episode. Bye for now.